homeless man was handcuffed in the middle of the street for disturbing the peace. No ID, no lawyer, no one on his side. But then, during the court hearing that morning, his name was read aloud, and the judge suddenly stood up. No one understood why, until the truth was finally revealed. Welcome to NT, where everyday kindness becomes unforgettable. Let's begin this journey together. Every morning, on a street corner in South Philadelphia, people would spot an old man with silver hair and a worn military backpack slowly walking past the Italian market. He never begged, never shouted, never caused a scene. Locals called him Old Manny, like he was just part of the sidewalk, like a street lamp or a trash bin people walked by without thinking twice. He often sat on the steps outside the public library, holding an old newspaper someone had left behind. When he wasn't reading, he picked up cans and bottles, tucked them into a fabric bag slung over his shoulder. It kept the streets a little cleaner and gave him just enough change to get by. With his faded green army coat, sun-beaten face, and quiet eyes, most people figured he was just another homeless man. But hardly anyone knew that Manuel Alvarez, 67, had once been a staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, a man who went into combat 3 times and once drove a supply truck straight through enemy fire in Fallujah to save his unit. He'd been decorated for bravery. He'd had a wife, a home, a quiet life in West Oak Lane. That was before his wife Elena got sick. The VA hospital misdiagnosed her. By the time they realized it was advanced ovarian cancer, it was already too late. They tried everything: medication, treatment, prayer. When insurance ran out, Manny sold their little house, the one they had lived in for nearly 30 years, just to keep fighting for a little more time together. He spent every last penny trying to save her, but it wasn't enough. Elena passed away one morning in October, in his arms, at a small clinic outside the city. No family around, no doctors talking in hushed tones, just Manny and the thin, fading hands of the woman he loved more than life itself. After the funeral, there was nothing left. The house was gone, the savings emptied. Relatives were scattered, distant, and few. He spent the first night sleeping in his old car, until the engine finally gave out and he had to leave even in that behind. From then on, he was homeless, not because he gave up, but because there was nothing left to hold on to. He wandered the city, surviving off recycling. On good days, kind kitchen workers from the market would hand him leftover food. When someone asked how he was doing, he'd shrug and say, "Don't need much, just peace and quiet." He wasn't a drunk, wasn't angry at the world, didn't ask for help. He was just too tired to start over, and too broken to explain what he'd lost. Inside his left coat pocket, he always kept a small photo of Elena, wrapped in an old piece of plastic. Whenever the nights turned cold, he'd sit under the overhang of an abandoned store, pull out that picture, and stare at it in silence. That morning, Philadelphia was colder than usual. Wind swept down the narrow streets, cutting right through Manny's tattered coat. He sat outside a used bookstore on South Broad Street, arms wrapped around a bag of cans, legs stretched out in front of him, eyes half closed in the pale morning light. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting, like he did most mornings. But this morning was different. Sirens echoed from the end of the block. A police cruiser rolled slowly down the street, followed by 2 city trucks and a group of workers in bright orange safety vests. One of them got out, holding a loudspeaker. "Sidewalk sweep. If you don't have ID or residency, you need to clear out now." Manny blinked awake. He didn't realize they were talking about him. All around him were other people. A few men sleeping against the wall, a woman curled up in a sleeping bag, an elderly couple sharing a box of donated food. Within minutes, the workers and officers began rounding people up. Those who hesitated were dragged to their feet. Those who moved too slow were handcuffed. No one asked for names. No one cared who was who. It was just about clearing the sidewalk. A young officer passed by Manny. He paused when he noticed the old, scratched military dog tag hanging from Manny's neck. The name M. Alvarez was still faintly visible. The officer knelt down slightly and asked quietly, "Sir, are you a veteran?" Manny nodded. Didn't say anything else. The young cop glanced around, as if unsure what to do, but before he could act, a commanding voice shouted from behind, "Hurry it up! No exceptions, everyone goes!" A few seconds later, cold handcuffs clicked around Manny's thin wrists. He didn't fight, he just winced a little, more from the sting of being handled like a criminal than from the pressure on his bones. They led him to the van like he was just another forgotten item from the sidewalk. That morning, over 20 people were taken to the 3rd District Police Station. On the booking sheet, his name was entered like this: Manuel Alvarez, homeless, suspected public disturbance. He didn't say a word the entire day. No arguments, no explanations. He didn't talk about his past, didn't mention the war, or the medals. He just sat there, silent, on a cold metal bench at the precinct, his old hands folded tightly in his lap, like he was trying to hold on to something inside that hadn't let go yet. That afternoon, an admin clerk asked, "Do you have any family we can call?" Manny just shook his head, then turned to look out the window, where a thin stream of February sunlight slipped through the blinds. His eyes followed a lone bird flying across the sky. He didn't look angry, didn't look sad, just empty. The next morning was still cold, gray. A light layer of fog hovered over the street outside the Philadelphia Municipal Courthouse. Inside courtroom 4, the benches were mostly empty. It was just another morning in the justice system, a routine shuffle of small cases, quick hearings, and paperwork. Manny sat quietly in the defendant's seat, same faded army coat, same worn-out shoes. His hands rested on his knees, eyes on the floor. No one beside him. No family, no private attorney, just a court-appointed lawyer who showed up minutes before the hearing began. He only asked one question. "Do you plan to plead guilty?" Manny gave a small shrug. "Not sure I even did anything wrong." The lawyer stared at him for a second, then turned away without another word. When Manny's case was called, the court clerk read aloud, "Case number 17B124. City of Philadelphia versus Manuel Alvarez. Charge, public disturbance. Defendant has no fixed address." On the bench above, Judge Andrew Sullivan flipped through the file like he'd done hundreds of times that week. He was known for being strict, efficient, a man who didn't like long stories or wasted time. But then he heard the name, Manuel Alvarez, and his hand froze. His eyes left the file, looked up, one deep breath, and another. He studied the man standing before him. Thin, silver beard, old army coat, but those eyes, they didn't belong to a troublemaker. He flipped back through the papers. Full name, Manuel R. Alvarez. Date of birth, military ID number, last known address on file with the VA. His heart skipped a beat. Then, like a curtain lifting from memory, an old image flickered in his mind. Fallujah, smoke, gunfire. A soldier running through flames, dragging a wounded comrade out of a burning truck. The radio screaming, "Grunt 1, fall back, it's gonna blow." And the reply, crackling through the static, "Not yet, I've got someone still in there." Judge Sullivan had never forgotten that moment, or that voice. He never caught the soldier's full name, only the last, Alvarez. And that after the war, he vanished. The courtroom stayed silent. No one had a clue what was going through the judge's mind. Sullivan slowly set the file down, clasped his hands, then looked Manny straight in the eye. "Mr. Alvarez, did you serve in the military?" Manny lifted his head, nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. What unit?" "Marines. Bravo Company, Fallujah, 2004. That answer hit like a hammer to the chest. Sullivan stood up suddenly, sharply, something you rarely saw in a courtroom like this. Everyone jolted in surprise. The defense attorney turned toward the judge, confused. The clerk looked up from her keyboard. "Court will recess for 15 minutes, Judge Sullivan said. His voice was slightly shaky, something no one had ever heard from him before. Then he stepped down from the bench and walked straight into his chambers. "Hold Mr. Alvarez in the waiting area. Do not let him leave the courthouse." Judge Sullivan turned and walked quickly into his private chambers, leaving the courtroom behind, filled with confused glances and quiet murmurs. While people whispered and speculated, Manny just sat still on the wooden bench, clutching the small photo hidden in his chest pocket. He had no idea what was going on. Behind the thick wooden door of his chambers, Judge Andrew Sullivan leaned over his desk, both hands pressing into the wood as if steadying himself. In nearly 20 years on the bench, he'd seen tired faces, guilty stares, and excuses he'd heard 100 times. But that morning, that look in Manny Alvarez's eyes was different. No begging, no fear, no resentment. Just a deep, quiet weariness. It was the same look he had seen in soldiers, men who made it back from war, but never truly returned. Sullivan moved quickly to the filing cabinet in the corner. From the bottom drawer, he pulled out a small wooden box, the last thing he still kept from his time as a combat medic. He opened the lid and rifled through until he found a worn, yellowed photo. It had been taken in Fallujah, right after a chaotic evacuation. In the background was a makeshift medical tent, propped up with tarps and crates. In the center stood a group of young Marines, smiling despite their exhaustion. Back then, just a private first class was in the front row, his arm in a sling, one leg wrapped, crutches under his arm. And just behind him, taller, stronger, looking straight into the camera, was Manuel Alvarez. The man who had dragged him out of the burning vehicle that night under fire. The man who had carried him nearly 2 miles through a war zone with shrapnel in his own leg. The man who had whispered words that Sullivan never forgot. "Just breathe, kid. You're not done yet." Sullivan's hand trembled slightly as he placed the photo on his desk. He turned to his computer, logged into the court's secure system, and pulled up an old directory, still linked to the Department of Veterans Affairs. He typed in the name, Manuel R. Alvarez, service number 875-2219-46, Unit Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. The file came up almost instantly. Deployments, Iraq 2004, Afghanistan 2002 and 2006. Awards, Bronze Star for Valor during medical evacuation under fire, Purple Heart for combat injuries, discharge status, honorable 2007, and then, at the bottom of the file, a recently declassified internal report. Subject: during an emergency evacuation at Fallujah, Staff Sergeant Alvarez carried an injured combat medic through active fire to a secure zone despite suffering shrapnel wounds himself. The medic he saved was Private First Class Michael A. Sullivan, now serving as a municipal judge in Philadelphia. The room went still. Sullivan leaned back in his chair, rubbed his face with both hands, trying to push back the wave of disbelief. He had spent years, nearly 2 decades, wondering what happened to the man who saved his life. Every time he attended a veterans event, he listened for the name Alvarez. He figured maybe the guy had died, or moved out of state, or just didn't want to be found. But now, he was sitting just down the hall, being charged like a common street offender. Judge Sullivan returned to his desk. His hand still unsteady, he scribbled a short note in his own handwriting. Then he picked up the phone and dialed a number burned into memory. A calm, deep voice answered. "Colonel James Fulton speaking." "Jim, it's Andrew. I found him. Alvarez. The man who pulled me out of Fallujah." There was silence, then almost a whisper on the other end. "Are you serious?" "I'm looking at his file. He's in my courtroom right now. Picked up for disturbing the peace." Another pause. Then Colonel Fulton's voice, quiet but sharp. "Don't let him leave. I'm on my way." Before leaving his chambers, Judge Sullivan placed the old photo in a small frame. In the photo, he was a young Marine, smiling faintly after surviving what should have killed him. and behind him stood Alvarez, the man who had dragged him out of the fire, calm-eyed as always. One man celebrated, the other forgotten. But now, Judge Sullivan knew one thing for sure. That would no longer be the case. That afternoon, when court resumed, the room felt different. Same furniture, same dim sunlight filtering through the windows. But now, every pair of eyes in the room was focused. A few local reporters had shown up. And toward the back row, a few men and women in uniform sat quietly, hands folded, watching the old man seated at the defense table. Manuel Alvarez still had no idea what was going on. He didn't know who had called whom, didn't know why no one was rushing him to plead guilty anymore. He only knew people were looking at him differently now. The courtroom doors opened. A tall man in a full Navy dress uniform entered, chest covered in medals. His name tag read Fulton. Fulton's old comrade from Iraq had arrived. He wasn't summoned by a letter, he came because of a phone call from a shaken friend, Judge Andrew Sullivan. After being sworn in, Colonel Fulton stepped up to the witness stand. His voice was steady, each word clear and sharp like it had been rehearsed in the heart, not on paper. I'm Colonel James Fulton, currently stationed at Fort Indiantown Gap. I've known Staff Sergeant Manuel Alvarez since 2003. We served together in Fallujah. He paused, locking eyes with Manny for a moment. Then his voice dropped lower, not weaker, just heavier. This man saved my life and the lives of at least 17 others. Our supply convoy was ambushed, chaos everywhere. But Manny, he jumped into a burning truck and drove it out of the kill zone. He did it so the rest of us could make it home. The room fell absolutely silent. Colonel Fulton took a breath and continued. He was injured during that mission, but even then, he carried a wounded medic almost 2 miles back to safety. That medic is now the judge presiding over this court. Every head turned toward the bench. Judge Sullivan, usually unreadable, simply nodded. Once, slowly, deliberately. A long pause followed. Then the young prosecutor finally stood, clearly rattled, and said awkwardly, "Your Honor, while we respect Mr. Alvarez's military record, the charges still stand. This is, after all, a legal matter." Colonel Fulton cut him off. "With respect, I'd like to add something." He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a folded document. "This is from the Department of Veterans Affairs. In 2008, after Monsieur Alvarez's wife passed, his benefits file was updated to an old address during a system migration. He never received notice. And for 15 years, he's lived without a cent of the support he earned, and never once complained." The prosecutor was silent now. Fulton's voice softened, but carried weight. "He's owed more than $246,000. 0 cents in back pay, not including medical care, PTSD treatment, or coverage for his combat wounds. And in all that time, he never asked for anything." The courtroom went still again. Manny sat in silence, hands folded, head slightly lowered, as if waiting for something, but not sure if he should believe it's really happening. It wasn't a spotlight shining on him, it was the truth. Finally stepping into the room after years of silence, when Colonel Fulton finished speaking, no one dared interrupt, because deep down, they all felt it. This wasn't just a man's history being revealed, it was a promise long broken, quietly being restored. Manny didn't cry. He didn't smile either. He just sat there, still, as if a tiny weight had finally been lifted off his chest after all those years of silence. Judge Andrew Sullivan sat upright, removed his glasses, and looked directly at the man before him. "Mr. Alvarez," he said, voice steady but laced with emotion, "yesterday I didn't recognize you, but today I know exactly who you are." The courtroom fell silent. "Nearly 20 years ago, you saved my life. And I've spent years trying to find the man who did, not because I owed him, but because I knew he deserved to be remembered." Judge Sullivan turned to the prosecutor. Given the new information from the Department of Veterans Affairs and Colonel Fulton's testimony, does the prosecution wish to proceed? The young prosecutor looked down at his notes, then over at Manny. He stood up, voice trembling slightly, but clear. Your Honor, the district attorney's office moves to drop all charges against Mr. Manuel Alvarez, with the utmost respect. Motion granted, Sullivan nodded. Mr. Alvarez, you are free to go. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then a young soldier in uniform stood and gave a silent salute. Another man stood and placed a hand over his heart. No speeches, no applause, just people rising to their feet, one by one, in quiet respect for a man they once never noticed. For the first time in years, Manny stood up too, not in silence, not in handcuffs, but in front of a room full of people who finally saw him. Within 48 hours of the hearing, his story had gone viral. News outlets across the country ran headlines like, "Homeless veteran arrested, judge stands in his honor." People from all over sent letters, gifts, and donations to a new fund, the Alvarez Initiative, created to provide legal and financial support for homeless veterans. The Department of Veterans Affairs issued an official statement and launched a nationwide investigation into administrative errors that had cut off benefits from veterans like Manny. To many, Manny Moore Alvarez became more than just a man. He became a symbol for every person who had been forgotten, overlooked, and who bore their burden quietly without ever asking for recognition. 2 weeks later, Manny moved into Veterans Village, a small community housing complex for former service members in North Philadelphia. His new apartment was modest, a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor, about 600 square feet, a single bed, a small dining table, an empty bookshelf, and a window that looked out over a park. For most people, it was nothing special. But to Manny, it was the first real home he'd had in nearly 15 years. On the wall above his bed, he hung just 3 things: a faded wedding photo of Elena, smiling in a simple white dress with her hair pinned up, a worn photograph of Bravo Company in Fallujah, where he once served, and lastly, a picture of him standing next to Judge Sullivan, both dressed in full uniform, at a veterans ceremony, hands clasped, eyes full of something deeper than words could say. Manny declined all interviews from national media. He didn't want the spotlight. Instead, he began speaking at local high schools to kids who were lost, angry, or just trying to find direction. He didn't preach, didn't read from a script. He just sat down and talked about war, about silence, about losing someone you love and not being able to do a thing to stop it, about pride, the kind that kept him from asking for help, but also kept him alive. One teacher later said, "That was the first time my students sat quiet for a full class. No phones, no jokes. They listened." Because he didn't speak like a hero. He spoke like someone who lived it. One spring afternoon, after a light rain, Manny walked to the park and sat beneath an old oak tree, on the same bench where, years ago, he used to sleep when he had nowhere else to go. This time, he held a warm cup of coffee. The sun shone softly through the leaves. Children played in the distance, and he just smiled, not wide, but real and peaceful. A young boy passed by, slowed down, and looked at him curiously. "Are you the guy from the news? The one the courtroom stood up for?" Manny nodded gently. "You don't look homeless," the boy said. Manny chuckled, sipped his coffee, and replied, "That's the thing, kid. You can't always tell who someone is just by looking." The story of Manuel Alvarez isn't just touching. It's a wake-up call. Not everyone who's quiet is useless. Not everyone in worn clothes is worthless. And not everyone who's forgotten wants pity. Sometimes all they really need is to be seen for who they truly are. Have you ever misjudged someone based on how they looked? Comment yes if you've ever been there, and maybe learn something from it. If you believe justice and kindness are never too late, subscribe to NT Amazing Stories, where we share real stories, powerful lessons, and the lives of people who were once forgotten but never gave up. Because sometimes the right story can change how the world sees a person.